Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome once again to these lectures on cultural studies being brought to you by NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. We are in module 3 of these lectures on cultural studies, and as you are aware, this module is entitled Sites of Cultural Studies, which I explained in the last lecture. Nevertheless, let us do a quick recap. As I had mentioned in the last lecture, sites are locations where all these theories that we have learned and key concepts that we had learned about culture and cultural studies are played out, are worked out, and our endeavor in these lectures in module 3 is to see how these concepts have been applied. To the effect, we looked at the body in the last lecture, and we saw that we may make a distinction between the organic body, which is the pre-social body, and the performed body, which is the social body. We saw that in reality, in cultural practice, bodies are no longer simply organic bodies or pre-social bodies. Bodies are from birth the social bodies, or what is known as the performed bodies. Bodies are from birth appropriated by culture. We saw that the body and culture are related from the beginning. In the sense A, we saw that it was related, body and culture are related by from the moment of birth. Okay. Body and culture are also if you look at the slide here, are also related in the sense that embodiment affects perception and interpretation. Okay. Today the paradigm, the current paradigm, a strong paradigm in philosophy, in the social sciences and humanities, is that of embodiment, and embodiment, our perceptions and interpretations are seen to come from embodiment, which affects identity and knowledge, and is it is through the body that we encode social values and changes. So, we moved in in the last lecture, an important point was the shift from the so called pre-social organic body to the social body. Next, we read from Chris Barker's The Sage Dictionary of Cultural Studies, where he said that the body has within cultural studies been stylized and performed by the workings of culture, whereas the body was always understood in a commonsensical sort of way as simply physical flesh and bones of an organism, going by the dualistic philosophy of Descartes, of Cartesian dualism, where mind and body were seen as separate substances or substrates. Barker, on the other hand, argues in these lines that the body has been stylized and performed by the workings of culture, making the idea of the body as a pre-social, pre-cultural object impossible to sustain. Then we saw through Michel Foucault's important book, Discipline and Punish, where he draws a history of speaking about the body, okay? The discourse about the body, and the body as a social instrument, right, as a social entity. And this is the shift that we saw in the last lecture, the body which was a target of punishment and through incarceration, of imprisonment. Okay. By the 19th century, by the discourses of the 19th century human sciences, the body is, the control over the body is not so much overt as something that is prescriptive. Okay. The body is to be prescribed and controlled through the what he calls normalizing techniques of the discourses of 19th century human sciences. We saw all of this in a bit of detail. For instance, while talking about hysteria, the hysterization of the female body, about deviant sexuality, etc. Okay. So, the control is now by the 19th century not one of visible punishment, but of of covert, so to speak. Okay. Normalizing techniques through writing about the body in various domains. Next, we looked at the concept of body work, and we saw that work on the body that we perform, okay, is through regimes of diet, of fashion, of cosmetic surgery, health promotion strategies that call out to you to to have the perfect body, so to speak, the fit body, the totally healthy body, and exercises and organ transplants. So, body work involves all of these and more, and this is how the body is rendered a cultural body, or a body in a body that is already social. Finally, we ended with the new disciplinary apparatuses that seek today in contemporary times to discipline the body, to subject the body to society, and we found that some of these apparatuses, disciplinary apparatuses, are which are slightly different from the apparatuses we saw, the discourses of the 19th century human sciences. And these are, for instance, aggressive health promotion schemes, right? The medicalization of lifestyles, the marketing of health promotion schemes and medicalization, and a different idea or discourse about health, attitude and morality, wherein even leading a moral life includes attention to your health, attention to to the body, as most importantly as prescribed by these new disciplinary apparatuses. So, today we will move on to another site of cultural studies, which is space, and the key source texts in this lecture, from which I draw the points and from which I also quote, are again Chris Barker's Cultural Studies Theory and Practice and Pramod K. Nair's Introduction to Cultural Studies. Well, first a look at what again Michel Foucault tells us about space, and Foucault, as quoted in Barker, and let us read from here: a whole history remains to be written of spaces. Okay, he says that space is something whose history needs to be described, whose history needs to be delineated, the ways in which mankind has looked, different ways in which mankind has looked at space, okay, has talked about space, has understood space, is a history that needs, okay, to be looked at. And please look at this slide. A whole history remains to be written of spaces, which would at the same time be the history of powers. This is most important. Okay? The history according to, and as you know by now, the key word in or some of the keywords in Foucault's philosophy are those like power, like knowledge, Okay? And he says here that the history of spaces would not just be a history of geography, it would as a exercise in theorizing culturally, in theorizing space culturally, it would be also concurrently a history of powers. So, a whole history remains to be written of spaces which would at the same time be the history of powers, both these terms in the plural. From the great strategies of geopolitics to the little tactics of the habitat. Okay? So, space understood through a whole spectrum. For instance, here he says that space is to be understood as deeply entwined with power, with structures of power, with realities of power, with the dynamics of power, and secondly, the spectrum ranges from small for as what we call little spaces like the habitat that we places that we inhabit, spaces that we inhabit, to the global scale, to geopolitics, that is understanding the politics of geography of space. So, Foucault very early on had in fact pointed to this, the need to study space from a cultural point of view, particularly as deeply entwined with the structures of power. Now, space, if you look at the slide, space therefore, in how many ways can we look at space in cultural studies? A few of the ways are mentioned here. Okay? A, of course, we look at space as something physical. We look at space as place. We look at space as as topography. We look at space as geography, and this is one way, of course, through which we look at space. However, in cultural studies, as various critics have shown, space is also symbolic. Let's look at this slide here. Space is not simply physical, space is symbolic, space is also an abstraction. Okay? Instead of being a concrete locatable place, space is symbolic, space is further political. As we saw in the last slide when we talked about Foucault's insistence that space should be read, the history of space should be written and read as a history also of power. And space is metaphoric, space has to do or creates identity, and there are emotions or sentiments that are associated with space. Okay? So, in the first place we now saw that like other topics or like other sides, for instance, okay, like the body, in the last lecture when you looked at the body, for instance, space too is to be seen as something extra and or beyond the physical, that is symbolic, political, sentimental or emotional, identity creating and metaphorical. Now, there are certain themes about space which Nair brings to us in his book on Introduction to Cultural Studies through a theorist named Doreen Massey. And there are certain themes about space that he brings to the fore through the work of Massey, and these are: number one, space is a social construct. Okay? So, we have to discard our sort of commonsensical view that space is to do with something concrete. Okay? Space is to that space is a given, right. On the other hand, critics have pointed out that space is a social construct. Okay? It may be a little odd at this juncture to look for us to accept the fact that space is not about landscapes, or space is not about topography, geography, that space is a social construct. But throughout this lecture, I hope through the works of the critics of cultural theorists to show you that indeed space is definitely something that is social and symbolic. Second, the social is located in space. Okay? That is, the first point was what we saw, that space is a social construct, and the corollary of this first point is that the social is located in space. Okay? Where does the social happen? The social happens in a particular place. So, the first point here is the relation between, the correlation between the social and the spatial. Okay? That is, this is the word, the social and the spatial. Point number 3. So, see, from space to social, we have now the theoretical construct social space. Okay. Social space is always dynamic, constituted by social relations. Okay. It is not something flexible, it is not something that is static, it is something that is dynamic and changing. And why changing? Because it is constituted by social relations that are also changing from time to time. Next, space is also about power, real or symbolic. Now, these are points that we will be unpacking in a while. So, we just look here at the themes about space as given to us by critics. So, space is also about power, real or symbolic. Social space might consist of contradictory, even conflictual spaces. Okay? It is never one space, but many spaces. So, final point here is about the fact that social space is, it is not that these spaces are homogeneous, it is not that these spaces are without conflict. Okay? So, social space is also contradictory, it is conflictual and it comprises several spaces. It is not to be understood in a homogeneous sort of way. Therefore, the space and the social may be shown in the form of a diagram, as we have to understand social space or the space and the social as being symbolic, being a social construct, being dynamic and changing, being contradictory, being multi-layered and being entwined with power. So, what is the scope then of this social space? Okay. What is the scope of space studies as such? Very broadly put, okay, we may talk about 3 aspects here as given to us by space critics. These are: A, lifestyle. Okay. The scope of studying space as social space, as as a cultural social cultural construct, first impinges on our lifestyle. So, we need to show how space impinges on lifestyle, how space creates lifestyle, okay, and on the other hand how lifestyle also affects space. Second, space definitely affects social relations and vice versa. Social relations also recreate space in many different ways, and space is to do with emotion. Okay. Space is deeply entwined with our emotions. So, if you look at the scope, so how are we going to talk about and how are we going to show space as a site? We look at these 3 aspects: lifestyle, social relations and emotion. Now, let me read a bit from Pramod Nair's text. This is how he articulates it: space informs lifestyle because the geography of your home and office is often determined and determines your class and social status. So, let us look at this first. This is a two-way happening. It is a dialectical happening, in the sense that he says, first we said that lifestyle is what we need to look at, okay, if you have to understand the social space concept. He says space informs lifestyle because the geography, okay, the geography of your home and office is often determined and determines your class and social status, right. For instance, where your home is located, where your office is located is not just a matter of geographical sites or geographical locations, okay. It is also a marker of your class and social status. Where you live determines how you live. Okay. The environment in which you live, even the physical locations of in which you live, okay, these determine how you are going to lead your life. That is, this determines your lifestyle. It informs your work habits and your modes of transport, the accessibility to your office, how soon, what the time taken to reach your office also obviously determines if you have to travel a very long distance to your office, these also determine your energy levels, your time levels, and your time for luxury, your time to be spent with your family. So, you see how lifestyle is deeply related to space, is deeply related particularly to your home, the the environment in which your home is located, the environment in which your office is located. So, distance, distance, location, space, these are not simply terms that we use only in only in studies of geography. These are realities that determine our lifestyles. So, it informs your work habits and your modes of transport. If, for example, you live in the suburbs, then commuting to and from your place of work, this is what we discussed, from your place of work occupies much time. The options of driving to work or using the public transport system are open to you. The time spent on commuting determines the amount of time you have to socialize in the evening after all. So, this the very location and the distance between your home and your office, you see how it determines so much in our life. That determines whether we have time to socialize, it determines what kind of transport we are going to use according to and it also determines our class and social status. Therefore, this is again let us put in a different way. We see that lifestyle, lifestyle is related to location, to time and to commuting. The next point that I would like to bring to your notice is, these are the two terms, space and place. Now, the question we ask here is, are these the same? These are synonyms, all right, but is space place and is place space? So, if there is a difference between space and place, then why are we looking at space and not at place? So, we will be looking at this difference in the next slide. Now, in the social construction of space, we find that social relations determine the nature and extent of space, and in order to understand this formulation, it is important to see the difference or look at the difference between space and place. The first and most important difference here is, within cultural studies, within theorizing in cultural studies, we understand, please look at this slide, space as an abstraction. Remember, I had mentioned almost several times, that when you have a concept, in cultural studies, the concept cannot be too concrete. Why? Because concepts are ideas that have a certain degree of abstraction, because it should fulfill, or it should perform the job of explaining many concrete situations. So, in that sense, we have to have a certain degree of abstractness given to space. So, please look at this slide. Space is an abstraction, an idea, a concept. A place, on the other hand, is, this is the term, lived space. So, where space is an abstract term, it is an idea. Place is defined as lived space, right. So, again, space is designed on paper and in theories. Place is when people occupy that space, build on it, live in it. Therefore, place is about human experience, meaning and identity. So, you see the important difference between space as a theoretical concept and place as something where human experience, meaning and identity are concerned, are acted out. In the social construction of space, therefore, what are the terms that we use, or what are the entities that are involved in the social construction of space, and these are the ones, please look at the slide: work, family, leisure, consumption and privacy. We space impinges on all of these variables. Okay. We saw in the in just a while ago when we talked about work, for instance, okay, the workplace and how it affects our lifestyle. In the same way, even in the family, for instance, right, this how much space is there in even actual space, okay, in a particular household will also determine the privacy, okay, the privacy that individuals or members of that family may enjoy, okay, and it goes on further to establish also their subjectivity and their identity. Okay. And leisure, consumption, places of consumption, for instance, where people even we talk about malls, for instance, okay, the spaces of the malls, the layout of the malls, okay, that also interpellates or beckons to us. So, work, family, leisure, consumption, privacy, okay, these are also determined by space, and also in a dialectical way they determine space. So, when we talk about space and power, remember the relation between space and power was insisted upon by Michel Foucault, as we saw in just a while ago. Space and is related to power in the sense of what is the what is the access that we have to space, or do we have access to all spaces? Okay. Do we have access, or the very fact that there are places where there are no, or there are the space where there is no trespassing is not tolerated, for instance. Okay. There are areas in offices in which to which you don't have ready admission, right. These are also implicated in power. The more access you have to space, the more powerful you are reckoned to be. So, space and power are seen in access to space. Second, the significance we give, the significance that we give to different spaces, okay, is also implicated with power, and relevance of space and authority. Okay, the authority that one has over certain spaces is also related to power. Access, significance of spaces, okay, then the relevance of spaces, and the authority we have over access and over denying or allowing access to others. These are also points that one needs to study when one looks at the correlation between space and power. So, we now move to another point, which is a point to do with cities. Okay. Okay, since for most of us, many of us who live in cities, who live in urban spaces, have been within the broader rubric of urban studies. Urban spaces or cities have been looked at by various critics, and these cities are cities are changing. Space is seen at its most dynamic, okay, in these locations, and therefore it is imperative that we look at how we may theorize the city. So, for this we are looking taking the help of Chris Barker, and this is the scope of studying the city that is shown to us by Barker. Now, it says that when we look at global cities, for instance, when we look at huge metropolises, right, we do not simply look at the skyscrapers, we do not look at the buildings, we do not look at the huge wide roads. Okay. When we look at global cities, these are of course the markers, these are the symbols of huge global sprawling global cities, but we look at these through the political economy. of global cities. We look at how the city is produced, okay? What are the relations of production which enable the growth of such cities, right? What are the social relations that emanate from such relations of production, okay? That is, what is the economics and power behind the construction of global cities, okay? This going beyond the glamour, so to speak, and the huge infrastructure of these cities. One way of looking or studying space in these metropolises, huge global cities, is through political economy, and particularly Marxism would help you here a lot in looking at the political economy of global cities. Next, the symbolic or cultural economics of urban regeneration, the symbolic or cultural economies of urban regeneration. That is, these are the markers that we had talked about just a while ago. There are cultural economics in the sense, for instance, how do I give you an example? For instance, if you look at the casino, okay, if you look at the casino in very huge well-to-do cities like Las Vegas, for instance, okay. If you look at again, if you look at different commercial outlets, different various commercial activities and cultural activities, if you look at hotels, for instance, okay, these are part and parcel of the political economy, but we call them cultural economies, or the symbolic economies of these global cities. Okay. Now, what are, we may ask, what are the symbolic or cultural economies of urban regeneration, right? When these cities are being made and remade, right? What are the cultural economies? That is one way of looking at space and what happens in space. Then the emergence of postmodern cities as contested spaces, right? Cities that are no longer, you could say, certainly not feudal, but cities that are also no longer modern in the sense that we understand it to be. Cities that are deeply homogeneous, I am very sorry, deeply heterogeneous, okay? Cities that are deeply heterogeneous, cities that in which very different lifestyles, in which very different class situations are seen, okay, in which very different ethnic situations are seen. These are the qualities or characteristics, these are the features of these huge global cities, where it be it Mumbai or be it London or New York. Okay. These cities are marked by as I said, a deeply heterogeneous way of living. So, the emergence of what he calls these postmodern cities, okay, as spaces of conflict. Remember, we found that in the beginning of the lecture, we saw that space is also conflictual. Okay, space is to be seen as sites of cultural conflict, right. So, the emergence of these postmodern cities, which accommodate, a diversity of lifestyles, a diversity of cultures, are contested sites. So, how the space is to be seen as a site of contest, particularly in postmodern cities, is another way of looking of studying space in cultural studies. Next, the idea that cities can be read as texts, okay, that you could, cities are, as we know, cities and space are symbolic, okay, they are not just physical, topographical. So, we can also then read, that is, we can analyze, okay, we can explore and analyze, we can critique these spaces, right, as texts that reveal the processes of symbolization, the processes of signification. Okay. These are texts that tell us a lot about its political economy, the texts that tell us a lot about their cultural economies. Okay. So, cities can be read as texts. Then finally, the virtual world of cyber cities. Okay. Now, we come to something very different, and I would be devoting a couple of lectures towards the end of the series of lectures on virtuality, on virtual culture, on cyberspace, etc. So, one of the ways in I won't talk about it right now. One of the ways in also which we can study space is where there is absolutely no space as we understand it in a physical topographical chain topographical sense. This is the virtual world of the cyber city. So, what happens in cyber cities is also the discourse, another discourse that has to be built. So, if you look at this slide again, what did we see? We saw that the scope of studying cities is indeed a very wide one, very wide ranging, in the sense that we can study political economy, we can study cultural economy, symbolization, we can study contestations, and we can study these as texts, and also we have to develop new terminologies as we study global cities and global spaces. Okay. Now, those of you who are interested in in following this up, these are the ways in which you may theorize in your projects, okay, on space and the urban city. So, studying the city has, studying space in the city has a very rich, okay, very rich discourse, or rather they are very rich discourses in this field, and we will quickly look at name some of the schools and some of the critics who have contributed to studying the city from a cultural studies point of view. So, the Chicago School studies plant life and ecology. David Harvey, a very well known Marxist scholar of geography, studies the city with reference to economic development, restructuring and investment. Davis studies cities and spaces with relation to power and surveillance. Zukin to symbolic culture, suburbanization and gentrification. Postmodernism, the postmodern city is one of studies on the postmodern city is one of the most important contributions by Soya, by the critic Soya, and information technology by Manuel Castells. Okay. So, you see these are the different ways in which the city may be explored, okay, in space in the city may be explored. Global cities are also what we may call command points. Okay, they are, the very phrase here, command points, means that they are spaces that wield a great deal of power, not only in within their own space, not only within the economy, within the political and cultural economies of only first world countries, okay, but throughout the globe. Okay, global cities are seen as command points of great economic and cultural power. And whenever there is a restructuring or a reorganizing or organization of the global economy, okay, there is also the restructuring of cities. This is a very important point. Okay. So, cities, urban spaces are change in the urban spaces is relative to change in the reorganization of global economy. As these command points change, okay, these global cities, as changes happen, political economic changes happen in these cities, there in the global economy, the arrangements of the global economy, there is also a concomitant restructuring of cities. Therefore, we may summarize by saying that urban spaces, okay, are to do with two kinds of economy. They are political economy, and what do we understand by political economy? Let me remind you once again. Political economy essentially, or rather simply put, talks about production okay, the modes of production, talks about the means of production, and also the social relations that arise because of these because of these modes of production. Okay. So, symbolic economy on the other hand are to do with markers. For instance, political economy is to do with the forces of production and the social relations of production. Social and forces and social relations of production, okay, and of course, of distribution and consumption. Okay. Along with that, the symbolic economy is to do with the markers, okay, to do with the symbols, or it is to do with the signs, okay, signs of that emanate from the state of the political economy in a particular given time. Okay. So, urban spaces, or why only urban spaces? We could say that space in general is to do with two kinds of economies, which are political economy and symbolic economy. Therefore, again looking at summarizing it through Nair, space is not simply land or built area. Space is made into place by everyday activities of people. Place is socially constructed through social relations. The spatial influences social relations and communities, and space is about power to control access, representation and use. Now, spaces of home according to Nair. Let us look at this slide here. Spaces of home is not simply place, not simply where we live. Okay. Home as a place in which we live, okay, in which there are various activities of living that are going on. Spaces of home use also the discourse of property, and in that it is related to social relations, related to relations, or ultimately to relations of production and the forces of production. Spaces of home are use the discourses of property. Spaces and home and housing are about lifestyles. Media urbanism marks cities increasingly linked to global spaces. Okay. The media and the city, okay, together the dynamics of the media and the city, okay, are linked to these global cities or global spaces, creating their own symbolic economy, okay, creating their own means and methods and sources of representation, sources of signification and of symbols. Now, the functional aesthetic of the home according to Nair is also linked to globalism. City development projects bureaucratize space, okay, and city development programs exhibit a translocal urbanism. So, this is again by way of continuation of how space to do with the home and the city, okay, may be theorized by us. Now, we will come to the discussion, and just before the discussion a few points on to do a quick recap is what did we find? We found that space is A, not simply a geographical entity. B, space is social and cultural. Okay. Next, space is to do with both political economy, which is the mode of production at a given point of time, including the forces of production, okay, and the social relations of production. And on the second, on the other level, space is also symbolic economy, that is, it is to do with markers or symbols and representations of space. Okay. So, these are the two ways we looked at it, and third, we found that the scope of space studies has to do with things like lifestyle, okay, for instance to do with emotion, right. And in lifestyle, for instance, examples given were those of even simple location of your home and office would ultimately determine things like your way of living, your lifestyle, whether you have enough enough time and energy for socializing, for instance. Then next is, through Foucault we found that it is very important to study power as far as space is concerned, because space is space is filled with power, space is saturated by power, and these we saw particularly in reference to access, okay, in reference to relevance of space, reference of significance of space, of authority one can have over space. So, we then finally moved on to studying the city. There are different ways of studying the city, okay, as both political and cultural economies of studying the city as global, global points of the global city, sorry, of command points and the power they have on a global scale, then media urbanization and the representations of the media that are created. Okay. So, let us look at a question like, how is space a social and not a merely material entity? We would then say that space, after Doreen Massey, the critic, we will say that space is related to the social in that it is symbolic, it is to do with power, it is a social construct, there is heterogeneity and multiple layers, space is dynamic, and space is also importantly particularly in postmodern cities, okay, in huge global cities, space is also a matter of social cultural context. Then show how space is related to class. Space is related to class through lifestyle, okay, and space is related to class in the sense that your very location or where you are located is will determine your time, okay, will determine your commuting, and finally, it will determine the lifestyle that you have. It will even go on to determine your identity and subjectivity. Then how is power inscribed in space? Is another important question. We just saw that even Foucault had said that the history of space should be seen as a history of power. Space and power are inscribed, both are inscribed in the other, in the sense that space is to do with access, space is to do with significance, authority and relevance, all of which are issues of power. Okay. So, even access to or non-access to a certain space would determine your status of power. Then how has the city been theorized in space studies? In different ways of studying the city is for instance, one of the most important ones way of looking at the city is for instance by David Harvey, where the city is studied in terms of economic development, restructuring and investment, and city is studied by Manuel Castells, for instance, through information technology. Okay. Cities are also seen as symbolic cultures, spaces of power and surveillance, okay, by different critics. Now, I hope in this lecture we have been able to show this shift from a very narrow way of looking at the city, looking at space as a topographical given, okay, to looking at space as something invested with power, something that is invested with politics, okay, with conflict, right, something that is invested or something that is that has deep implications for the way we understand ourselves, for the lifestyles that we conduct, for our access to power. Okay. I hope at least we have been able to make this first step in theorizing space. Those of you who are interested in this may look further at these critics and scholars that we have been talking about and how to theorize the space from a cultural, political, economic point of view. in the next lecture we are going to look at time. Okay. Time, as I said, is not simply something that you study in physics. Time is also deeply cultural. How it is cultural is particularly as time as understood through history and the way we carve out time in history, and we shall be looking at such a way of studying time in our next lecture. Thank you for now.